Our first session this morning, as I told you earlier, was about scooters. And if I was on the street, I would have been wearing a helmet. We did discuss that. The first session is transportation related. It's called Moving the Masses May Be Micro. The format that we follow for all of our sessions today will be that the staff will make a short presentation, followed by a panel discussion, and then the audience panel Q&A. Opening this session will be our moderator, my partner in running the COG for the last decade, Mark Nielsen, and he's the assistant director, I should have said, of the agency, and he's aided by our new transportation planning director, Rich Donovan. Without delay, please welcome Mark and Rich.
Good morning. As Rick mentioned, our session is named Moving the Masses May Be Micro. We're not quite sure what that means, but that's what we're going to explore, during the panel discussion. It sort of reflects a evolving, emerging technology that's becoming more and more popular. And let me just move that slide. And so so what we're going to be looking at is, what we've called active transportation. And we're putting together this plan that looks at all different forms of human-powered transportation. In the past, we would have done a regional bike plan and separately a regional pedestrian plan. Now what we want to do is accommodate all users in one comprehensive plan. We want to look at the needs of all people, all travelers, regardless of the mode they use, regardless of their age, regardless of their mobility abilities. So in this active transportation plan is going to look at the multi-use trails, the on-road bicycle routes, the interconnection of our sidewalks. And our goals are trying to expand mobility and improve connectivity and enhance pedestrian and bicycle safety. That last one is sort of one of the key. We want to do this in a very, very safe manner. This is our vision that we're going to include in the active transportation plan. Again, we want to accommodate all users, and it's got to be safe and protected. But one of the big keys is having to be continuous. One of the most difficult aspects when people want to use either riding a bicycle or walking is the gaps. They're walking along or they're riding along, and then all of a sudden the facility that they're using ends. So we want to have that continuous. And we sort of would be failing our job if we didn't make that connection to public transit. We always talk about the first mile, last mile connection to transit. And we're sort of thinking that this human-powered transportation could be that way of making that connection. One of the real keys also that we're looking at, and it's becoming much more of a important issue that we want to explore, is this notion of equity. And so what is equity? We're going to learn more about that in this afternoon's session. There's a difference between providing something that's equal and something that's equitable. And that's what we want to make sure that our active transportation system is equitable, which means we're, again, accommodating all abilities. Not everybody can ride an 18-speed racing bike. We have to accommodate that person, but we also have to accommodate children who might be on their first bicycle. We have to accommodate people who need mobility assistance. We need to accommodate people who are using other types of devices. And we want to make sure that we have an interconnected network so they can go from anywhere and go to everywhere, so that they can make their trip that they so desire. The planning effort is going to follow the typical planning process that we all sort of use. But in this case, again, we're going to be looking at soliciting comments from the public and stakeholders. We don't want to do this plan in a vacuum. We want to have a very strong, proactive public engagement. And And part of that is to identify some of the issues. We want to look at existing conditions. Why aren't people riding a bicycle more or walking more? Is it a matter of insufficient infrastructure? Is it a matter of safety concerns? So in order to define that, we can do that, looking at maps, looking at the geography, looking at the infrastructure that's in place. But we really need to talk to people. We need to talk to the communities where we want to locate some of these facilities and get their sense of what is needed. So that's going to be a real key. And from that, we're going to identify, what we can do to accommodate their travel needs. So we are going to we will be designing these things under a, basic design standard, because that leads to safe movement. And with that, I do want to turn the rest of the presentation over to Rich Donovan. He's going to explore the concept of micromobility in a lot more detail, because planners are always, it's always funny. We come up with a term and then we come up with a new term to replace that term. We've been talking about active transportation as a way of referring to human-powered transportation. Now we're referring to it as micromobility. And with that, Rich will go into that in a little bit more detail. Rich?
Great. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, so micromobility is a pretty broad category of devices. But really the key is that it is a human-powered device, typically a small device meant for one or up to 2 or 3 people, and often, but not always, some kind of electric assistance, which allows users to expand their range by quite a bit, especially those with those who are less inclined toward the sport of active transportation. And so we look at where micromobility fits in with our transportation system and into the active transportation plan. We look at 3 major areas. In our existing urban areas, micromobility expands the distance that somebody can cover without needing access to public transit or a vehicle or an automobile, allowing for somebody to spend more time, to enjoy more locations, and better experience the city in which they are. In the US, the vast majority of trips are under 3 miles, and even a significant majority of those are less than 1 mile. And so for many of these short trips that are currently taken by car, we know that we can replace those with some kind of micromobility as long as the infrastructure is there and it is safe and convenient to do. And lastly, we talk about the potential for micromobility to expand district parking or shared parking, something similar to a traditional village center where you can park once and visit multiple locations without needing to get back to your car. And so we talk a little bit now about how do we make it work. And with this, I'll bring Mark back to introduce our panelists and lead us into our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Rich. So again, what's up on the slide are the 3 main areas that we're going to focus in on: infrastructure, access, and safety. The infrastructure, we need to be able to provide a dedicated physical space, for people to use micromobility. And that leads into, access and then into safety. Because without that infrastructure, people aren't going to feel safe to, be on a road commingled with motorized vehicle traffic. So we want to develop a dedicated space where people can use their devices. And this sort of points to an emerging trend again. Rich mentioned the e-assisted devices because those are actually expanding the market or the availability to all people. And those devices are becoming more and more affordable. Batteries are becoming lower in cost, so the cost of those devices are coming into more of a range of more people. But the other issue is there's a increase in shared micromobility. These are the bike share, the e-scooter share, private companies that are offering fleets of vehicles that are located somewhere in logical places throughout an urban area that people can then use whenever they need it. And I was looking at some statistics, and the Association of Bike Share and Scooter Share Association estimated 67.9 million trips were made in 2020 using a shared device. I find that an incredibly large number. Another anecdotal comment is I was down in New York City a couple months or so ago, and I hadn't been there in a couple of years because of the pandemic. And New York City has a very extensive bike share program. At that time, all the bikes were pedal powered. Now they're all e-assisted. So it's something that's really going to be expanding. And again, we want to make this a safe environment. So with that, enough from the NVCOG staff. I want to introduce our panelists. First, I want to introduce Patrick Zapacca. Patrick is a transportation planner with the Connecticut Department of Transportation, and he has over 17 years of experience. He's also currently the manager of pedestrian safety through speed management programs. So he'll offer a perspective, the state perspective. Next, I want to introduce Amy Watkins. Amy is program manager for Watch for Me CT. And that's a pedestrian bicycle safety campaign that's funded by DOT, as well in partnership with the Connecticut Children's Injury Prevention Center. And she has over 20 years of community health education experience. And then finally, I want to introduce Doug Sladen. Doug is the executive director of Park New Haven and was formerly the city's director of transportation. And he co-organized New Haven's Safe Street Coalition and has worked on a number of efforts to develop dedicated bike facilities. And also joining the panel will be Rich Donovan. Rich, if you would care to join. So with that, we're going to start the panel discussion. A little change of venue from podium to stool. Good to sit down. First question I want to address to Patrick, because again, we've talked about the need for infrastructure improvements. And, so the question to Pat, what do you think are the biggest impediments to the adoption of micromobility in our communities, especially e-assisted devices?
All right. Thank you very much for having me here today. Before I go and begin to answer this question, I just want, the crowd to know that, over the past 5 to 10 years, the Department of Transportation has really had a huge culture change. From the planning perspective, we've really been diving in and working with our municipalities and our COGs. We've also been pushing a lot more responsibility on our municipalities and COGs for planning, design, and for construction. We have developed several programs that, we work directly with our municipalities and with our COGs, and we're starting to give them a little bit more oversight for the development of these projects. And this is, specifically in relation to complete streets. Our roadways that, I don't have to tell everybody, I'm sure everyone's pretty aware of what complete streets are. And I'm sorry if I'm squinting, it's super bright up here and I really cannot see anyone out there. So to answer the question of the biggest impediments, there's 3 things I want to touch upon. One, it's definitely the infrastructure. Our existing infrastructure is all catered toward vehicles. So if you want to take a community center such as Waterbury, how do our roadways look like to be able to accommodate, vehicles, truck traffic, bicycles and or e-assisted transportation, parking, and our businesses. What kind of recommendations can we make for our existing roadways that makes it safe for everybody to travel from their homes to work and or to our transit hubs, for example? The big thing about micromobility, there's 2 types of micromobility that we know of. There's dock stations. We're on our sidewalks, or you actually drive up and you charge your e-scooters and e-bicycles. That's an add-on where, from a state perspective, we're going to have to either work with the municipality to try to install those chargers, or maybe even the private sector to install those chargers on, private parking lots and such. And the other form is Dockless Charging, where a company will come in and they literally take care of everything, which is great. However, from the infrastructure standpoint, if a company comes in and, they deliver the e-assisted Scooters and bicycles, where are they parking them? Are there clutter issues on our sidewalks? Another thing with our infrastructure is, are these e-assisted scooters and bicycles really catered toward, a person with disabilities? If we want to, from a state perspective, provide this type of transportation, can it be catered for everybody, what's it, 16 years and older, I believe?
Yeah. And again, I think that, excuse me, leads into a good question for Doug, because again, we've talked about the question of equity. And one of the concerns we have at the region is some of the poorer communities, poorer neighborhoods, unfortunately have poor infrastructure, which makes the use of a micromobility device a little bit more difficult because of the concern of safety. So the question to Doug, how do you sort of see micromobility fitting into the issues of equity and economic mobility in a region?
Thank you. And thanks so much for having me here today. It's great to be visiting Naugatuck+Valley. In terms of equity, there's a lot of conversation lately specifically about equity, and a lot of people are starting to wrap their programs with this term, this word, with trainings around it. And from transportation equity's perspective, as Patrick mentioned, we have to have all abilities, all ages, and as mentioned in the slide, all incomes when we're talking about an equitable approach to transportation. So some of the biggest issues in transportation equity would be access to a sidewalk. And my joke is always, the answer is a sidewalk, what's the question? Because a city that is transit friendly is at first a walkable city. A city that's bikeable and a bike friendly city is first a walkable city. You can't walk and have a walkable city without sidewalks. And it's pretty clear from the way that we've grown, as mentioned, over the last century, that there's not nearly enough universal pedestrian access. So for transportation access, a sidewalk helps all users. Getting across the street is extremely important. There's a lot of infrastructure dedicated to getting people across the street. We can talk more about that in a moment or two. But I think from an equity standpoint, you're seeing a lot of people that walk to work, that take transit to work, that are having a tough time waiting in non-accessible spaces for their transit services.
And I guess this leads into a sort of follow-up question, because again, we always talk about cost of these devices. And I mean, do you sort of see, the proliferation of e-scooters, e-bikes as still being a prohibitive means for people who live in, a poorer neighborhood or do not, have a lower income? And should we be doing something to try to subsidize or make up that cost difference?
That's a great question. So, generally speaking, my experiences on electric foot scooters have been, they're wicked expensive wherever I'm traveling. And so the answer to the question, how do we make that accessible for more income streams? The broad answer is programs. Just like we have transit pass programs, we need micromobility transit pass programs. And a lot of organizations are working on these issues better than the city of New Haven. We had a $10 a year pass with our bike share system, which was for anybody that was in any federal or state program, full stop. We're not the ones trying to regulate your income. We're not trying to figure out your income. If you're in any state or federal program, you can have a bike share pass for $10 a year. When you're ultimately having to subsidize from the jump a new program, that that's not necessarily affordable for all people, so it's not necessarily going to be universally accessible. Even the $10 a year is going to be hard for some people to manage and maintain with regards to passes and do you have a phone and things like that.
And I think we are starting to see some of that happen. City of Ansonia, a scooter share company is just starting up some service there. In Borough of Naugatuck as well, there is a program that's starting up.
So can I just jump in real
Sure.
quick from a department standpoint? We've always been a very data-driven agency. It's the data that allows us to go after either state and or federal money. And with new programs such as micromobility, we don't really have that data behind it to justify going after millions of dollars to set up our own program. And like in Sonia, and I believe even in the city of Hartford, they have a micromobility company come in And they literally, they house all the scooters themselves, they charge them themselves, they have a master agreement that works with the city, which is great. You don't really need permission from the department, you can just set it up on your own. But from our biggest concern is safety is always an issue. You know, is there cluttering on the sidewalks, as Doug had mentioned earlier? It's great that a company comes in, but what happens? Are there any liabilities if, you know, the roadways aren't sufficient enough or the infrastructure isn't sufficient enough to handle 150 new e-scooters or 200 new e-bikes on our roadways in our urban areas?
And I think that's a good segue into a question for Amy, is the issue of safety. Because safety is becoming the top priority in almost anything that we do when we're looking at building roads or rehabilitating. And I guess the question we were going to ask is, do you think the use of these devices, as Patrick sort of alluded to, may cause us to rethink, you know, what is a safe street? You know, what that should look like? You know, what needs to be changed in order to accommodate, you know, these, you know, or you know, to the transportation system to better accommodate these devices?
Well, thank you for including safety in this discussion. It's a really important topic. Many people are injured and killed on our roads every year, and the numbers are not going in the right direction. But people have been walking since the beginning of time. People have been bicycling. They exist. People outside of cars exist. And we're really coming around as a society and as a culture, nationally, locally, across the world even, to looking at, you know, how complete are our streets? And what that means is, can everybody get around? Can you get around no matter what kind of equipment you're using, if you're in a car, if you're on a bike, if you're on foot, on micromobility, no matter where you live and who you are and what age you are. And I don't think that micromobility, the rise of that as another tool to get around, changes what a complete street is. A complete street is for everybody. And so when we are designing roads or redesigning and looking at neighborhoods and streets and cities, we should be considering, how does everybody get around? So everybody doesn't have a car. Some people use public transit. Some people are out there because they're exercising, because they have to use whatever they have to use to get wherever they're going. So are we taking everyone into consideration? Do we have sidewalks? Do we have crossing areas? Do we have lighting? Are cars slowed enough? You know, different things like that. So that whole concept of a complete street is for everybody just extends and covers all the people on the micromobility.
And as a follow-up, one of the concerns that we've sort of are wrestling with is that speed differential. You know, we're trying to create a complete street that accommodates all users. You know, walkers go maybe 3 miles an hour. Somebody on a e-scooter can go up to 15, 20 miles an hour. Somebody on a road bike can do 20, 25 miles an hour. Not to mention, you know, trying to commingle with traffic. So I guess as we're considering how to accommodate these devices, I mean, do we really have to decide, you know, no, we need dedicated spaces for all types? You know, what's your thought on that? And then I'll maybe ask Patrick and Doug as well.
Yeah, so, and you're absolutely right, and that is definitely one of the challenges is the speed. And, you know, one thing I want to bring to our attention, along with driver behavior, you know, with a lot of our roads, they're designed for vehicles to travel at a higher rate of speed. We know this, and from an engineering standpoint, the best way to reduce those speeds is to change the geometry of that roadway. So just recently we passed legislation, we were able to create, the municipalities, I believe, were able to create pedestrian safety zones. So you could take an urban area, say such as Waterbury in itself, and then you could pass your own, working through our Office of State Traffic Administration and create the city of Waterbury, just a town area, to reduce the speed to say 20 or 25 miles an hour. So, which is great, but you're still gonna need to change the roadways, to look at that roadway to help these vehicles reduce those speeds. We have countermeasures such as bump outs, bicycle lanes, you know, you could do parking. On local roads, they usually do like raised intersections, raised crosswalks. We're starting to try to introduce that on our state roads. What we do see a lot of is, you know, with urban areas is they'll introduce bike lanes and complete streets But it's that transition onto a state road. We haven't really got there yet. So, it's great on a local road, you can provide that infrastructure for bicyclists or e-bikes. When they get to a main road or a state-owned road, those facilities aren't there. So now it becomes a shared lane. And, that creates a sense of, for experienced riders, it's not a big deal, but for newbies and younger, less experienced riders, it becomes a safety concern for them. We're actually in the process of developing a toolbox to help come up with countermeasures to actually reduce these speeds in our urban areas. It's not approved yet, but we're working on it. So.
All right, I was just going to ask Rich to sort of weigh in as well, because Rich is a purveyor and user of a micro mobility device. He's fortunate that where he lives, he uses his e-scooter. When you saw Rick sort of trip over the scooter, Rich was more concerned about the scooter as opposed to Rick, because it was his scooter that he's using. So, and Rich uses that to go to the train station and then uses public transit to get up to the office. So, Rich, do you want to provide any insights?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, it is my scooter that attacked Rick, and that is critical for me to get home today, so. So I have, I do use that to commute into work here in Waterbury every day, and I have two very different aspects of that. When I start my ride, I'm on a much busier major state road. There is not a micromobility or bike lane on that road right now. And so I kind of go back and forth between riding in the shoulder and being able to hop up onto the sidewalk at any moment if necessary. And there's places where it's difficult to cross the intersections, and there's driveways that are tough. And the condition of the road itself makes it really difficult. With a bicycle, it can be rough, but not quite as bad because the wheels are much bigger. But on a scooter, even little holes in the road can be really dangerous. And so getting from my home to the train station is certainly pretty difficult. And so when I get off the train here in Waterbury, it's similar but different. And the key difference is that the urban context of the streets around here do make it a lot safer and certainly a lot more comfortable to share traffic, to ride in a shared traffic lane. To get from the train station over to our office, I go down past Library Park on Grand Street. And that's actually a very nice ride and generally feels very comfortable. And so, there's having the right facility is important, but having the right facility to match the context is really important as well. And especially when we get outside of some of our more traditional urban areas is where we need to look at some of these additional safety features.
Okay. And Doug, I just want to get back to you because you have had experience working on these types of projects in the city of New Haven. And I tend to think of New Haven as sort of a good example of, an effort to, create a lot of facilities for bicyclists and pedestrians. So, any closing thoughts and ideas about how we should proceed?
Definitely, and I think, as mentioned, each solution or each challenge is going to have its own unique solution. Each city is going to be different. Each region will be a little bit different. In New Haven, we had a bike share system that had no electricity behind it, but what was really interesting as regards to safety for all users especially is, those wheels are pretty large. They can actually handle most of our potholes, not all. So when you get down to these scooters and other things, it's really about the size of the wheel that's causing a lot of pain, suffering, literal pain and suffering for a lot of the users. For New Haven, we had a shared micromobility system, a shared bike share system, as opposed to a private bike share system or a private scooter system to get around. And mostly what you're hearing from a person who's using a scooter is, I wish there was a bike lane or I wish there was a sidewalk. And it's all about controlling for speed. Speed is 100% a factor in every crash. 100% a factor in every crash. And so what we think about in New Haven is 5 miles an hour, 15 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour. Our entire city is 25 miles an hour except for 5 streets. I know which ones they are. But our sidewalks are also, you're not allowed to bike on them because 20% of us walk to work. So when we're thinking about this, you should start thinking about speed limits on the sidewalk, 5 miles an hour. You mentioned humans walk about 2 to 3. You're running 12-minute miles, 5 miles an hour. 15 miles an hour in the bike lane, 25 miles an hour in the travel lane. And as mentioned, if you can get a pedestrian zone, You pass it at your local Board of Alders, your legislature locally, work with the Office of State Traffic Administration, and you can go down to 15 miles an hour for the entire street. And then now you're starting to prioritize all users. But again, is it safe enough still to cross the street to get to the place? One quick thing I'll say is that in New Haven, it'll be a little bit different. 100% of the homes in New Haven are within a quarter mile of a bus stop. Depends on how frequent that bus is, of course. But raise your, I can't see you, so raise your hand if you live within a quarter mile of a bus stop. If you live within a half mile of a bus stop, half mile is about a 10, 15-minute walk. And so, I'm thinking more for your region, you need secure storage at your middle mile transfer point. You need to be able to securely store your micromobility device at the bus stop so you can take the bus to the train, et cetera, et cetera. And at the end of your trip, you have a shared micromobility system that you can borrow there. Because we're not going to let you take 100 bicycles on the bus. We're not going to let you take 100 bicycles on the train. It just, the geometry won't work. So we need to have systems at both ends of your trip.
All right, with that, again, I think it was a good.
Got like half an hour to go.
We still got a half hour to go. All right. Sorry about that. I may be a good planner and know a lot of things about micromobility, but I don't have a watch, so I wasn't sure what time.
I could top on one more.
Oh yeah, go ahead, Doug. We do.
So it's really about mixing these systems together. How does your fixed route transit system, which is the workhorse of your economy, how is your bus system, which is the workhorse of your economy, how is that supported by micromobility, and how does it, again, how does a customer get to that fixed route middle mile, whether it's the train or the bus? And again, it's going to be is it a safe walk? Is it a comfortable walk? Can you sit down if you have to? Is there lighting, right? Is it interesting? So many of our walks are just, you're spending your entire time in a fight or flight mode, just cortisol, just shooting through your bodies, waiting for a car to hit you. So, we need to actually be able to walk to a bus stop, take a scooter to a bus stop, or put a bike there as well.
And again, that sort of brings up something I wanted to have Amy sort of touch base on, is this whole notion of education. I think people who have a bike or walk think they know how to walk and ride a bicycle or use a scooter. But I think, do you think education is necessary to really, so people know how to use these devices, know how to ride a bicycle, know how to cross the street? And then taking that even further is drivers have to learn the rules of the road as well. They have to understand that they need to yield to a pedestrian, they need to yield to a bicyclist. So can you sort of talk about, the whole aspect of education as one of the means for, improving, enhancing safety?
Yeah, absolutely. Education is a piece of the larger puzzle of safety. Many crashes with a lot of injuries with scooter use and bicycle use are people, especially with the scooters, that are novice riders and crash, not with the car, but just on the sidewalk. So certainly there's an aspect to teaching people how to safely use the equipment, where to ride it, to use a helmet, and to teach drivers where they should be expecting these people and teaching them that they need to share the road. But education is just a piece of the puzzle of the solution to safety. We also need some enforcement, and most of all, we need that engineering. We need the infrastructure that provides some safe, separated options for people, that provide all the things that Doug just mentioned, the places to sit and places that are well lit. So certainly, what I do in my work with Watch For Me is education and teaching people about what they need to do to be safe. But again, we're just part of a larger movement to reduce deaths, and that comes from slowing speeds, from having infrastructure that gets cars moving in a safe way around other users and gives other road users safe places to operate.
And Patrick, I just, not to sort of put you on the spot rather, But I mean, you did mention in your opening remarks that, you know, the sort of the culture of DOT is changing and has changed. We've noticed it, and I've been doing this a lot of years, and I remember one of we were looking to do some bicycle planning many years ago, and we were told, no, you can't do that. That's not transportation. So the department really has changed. But again, I guess the question I have is, as we're trying to actually build some of these facilities, a lot of times we're sort of, I'm not sure what the right word is, but because a lot of it is an 80% federal or state, and 20% is required from the local governments, that ratio of funding can also be a detriment to, you know, getting some of these improvements built in the neighborhoods or areas that, you know, really need them. You know, as we sort of mentioned earlier, you know, when we're talking about equity, a lot of the, you know, more disadvantaged communities, you know, experience, you know, much higher crash rates, higher rates of fatalities and serious injuries. You know, and as Amy, I'm not sure who mentioned, but when a pedestrian is hit by a car, the car usually survives pretty well, but the pedestrian really can suffer some serious injuries. So, and that could be a limiting factor. You know, the requirement that the poor cities and towns may not be able to actually, you know, justify using, you know, some of their limited resources. You know, so do you see that as an impediment? And, you know, is there a way of trying to address that so, based on need, you know, that requirement is reduced and there's more state investment, you know, provided?
Yeah, and you know, you're absolutely, I touched briefly on, you know, funding. You know, especially working with FHWA and our funding, you know, our funding categories can only be used for specific purposes. We have TA, or Transportation Alternative Funds, CMAQ, it's congestion mitigation, air quality. These are federal funding sources that are most likely to be used to incorporate trails and sidewalks and bike lanes and those type of complete streets, and there's only so much of that pot of money. You know, it's hard that when there's a safety concern, we have safety funds, but we can't always, like when we're in the middle of a design, you know, if we have bridge money to replace a bridge, there's no room within that funding to add a sidewalk or to incorporate something like that. So, you know, from a department standpoint, we're trying to come up with creative ways to incorporate sidewalks or other complete street, you know, features within that roadway. Speed management, which is a big thing, we're looking at, you know, bump outs is a big thing, you know, improved crosswalks, center medians. You know, we're looking at funding sources that we can incorporate that today within our projects, but sometimes it's just not within the scope. So that's just some of the challenges that we have. We have created pilot programs such as community connectivity. You know, we have a trip program for rural towns, you know, and that, you know, it's a state-funded program like our LOTSEP program, where we have a little bit more leeway where we can incorporate some of those types of features within our roadways. And another big concern that we have is we can have an urban area where there's businesses and there's parking on the side of the road. A lot of times what we have a problem with is we can improve that roadway and do a bike lane, but that means we're gonna have to get rid of parking. And when the business and those stakeholders get involved, well, I can't reduce parking in front of my business because I'm gonna lose X, Y, and Z clients. And so from a state perspective, we say, well, it's up to the town to figure out how you wanna make those improvements. And sometimes it bodes well and we can have, you know, features of bike lanes and parking in a great roadway, or there's no bike lane because we get that much kickback. And how far do you wanna hold up a project because you can't find a happy medium to try to improve these roadways?
Yeah. And Doug, you want to respond?
Well, I'll just add to and say that, again, sea changes are happening at the Connecticut DOT. You know, in my time as transportation director, a lot has changed. And most pointedly in our data category. So as mentioned, if without the data, you can't get funding. So Amy can speak more to the PR1, which is a document that police fill out for all crashes, the crash form, the uniform crash report. And, you know, that data alone has given, you know, transportation planners and designers a lot more information at the touch of a fingertip. Other information that's really, really required to make these equitable infrastructure investments, as mentioned, you know, the question is, what do you do for historically disadvantaged communities who have been under-resourced and under-invested for a generation? Well, the answer is you start investing. How do you know where to invest, though? And how do you justify these investments? What are your mission statements? What are your, your high-level value statements that are starting it? So in New Haven, what we've done, we have a pavement condition index, sidewalk condition index, and we've recently just done an intersection database of quality and standards. So a pavement condition index, you can hire the COG can hire for you, actually. Every town can get judged by the pavement quality. VHB does it for us. It's a firm that does things. Sidewalk condition index, same thing. So we know, based on a grade of 1 to 100, how good this sidewalk is. And if we're making investments on a pavement score of 85 and we've got a 74 around the corner, well, the 74 is asking, like, what's wrong with me? So in our sidewalk network, it's one that I focus on a lot, Fairhaven is a historically under-resourced community that has the worst sidewalks in our city, but the city has made a conscious effort over the last 7 to 10 years, thanks to these data efforts, to reinvest into these communities specifically, over-invest. So if they were traditionally under-resourced, we have to over-resource them for a while in order to make that
Right.
catch-up time.
And again, the concern is, there's a lot of competition in the resources. And that's sort of our concern is a community may say, yeah, we'd love to be able to do this, but we have to, provide for education. We have to provide, for our police departments and fire departments. And, it is a challenge. I know in the city of Waterbury, they did start the construction of a section of a trail, part of the Naugatuck River Greenway Trail, in the south end of the city, which is going to have a transformative, I think, impact in that neighborhood. It's going through a poor, underserved neighborhood. It's going through a former industrial site that now will make those areas more accessible. There's also neighborhoods that have less car ownership. And so this trail is actually going to provide that good alternative transportation facility for them to walk or to ride or go through. And that trail is going to be extended up to downtown through another project that the city is working on. So it's one aspect that we're probably working on.
Two quick thoughts. One, which is trails are part of infrastructure these days, and they haven't always been. So, as mentioned, there's TA, Transportation Alternatives money, but there's other monies as well for trails. You can actually, Denver, you're seeing as a region, invest in electric bike commuting. And so people are biking 40 miles on trail systems, safe, protected, away from cars. 40 miles on an electric bike to get to work in the morning, and that's not an unreasonable ask, I think. A lot of states, and ours is getting better, focus on trails as a way to get connectivities away from the vehicles. And I would say one other thing, which is Hartford and New Haven have been successful in a different federal pot of money. Gosh, congratulations on all the raised grants. This is unbelievable, by the way. That's unbelievable. Very jealous. But there's something called REACH by the CDC. So REACH is Racial and Ethnic Approaches to Community Health. And my response to hearing about the trail coming in certain neighborhoods is, do you have the outreach staff? Are we investing in the outreach staff to door knock and make sure that the safety pamphlets are in their hands, that we actually work with community groups, church groups, faith-based groups, to get messaging out there. The Board of Education, second graders, eighth graders are a great opportunity to educate people on how to use these trails safely. It's one of our struggles to tie off these transportation projects because certain funding only pays for certain things. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, well, that's great. I just to jump in and add on, I want everybody to know that we've just recently revamped our COG planning quarter study process. Not getting into all the details, but our goal is once we do a planning study, we're actually going to adamantly work with the region to try to push that into an actual design/construction project. And why is that important to know? Because when we do these planning studies, it's a great opportunity to include those complete streets. It's a great opportunity for them to do the data collection that they need, the justification that they need to go after these types of projects to better those communities. Several years ago, through the community connectivity program, we had a program that we went live with called the Road Safety Audit Program. And originally that was designed for a bicycle pedestrian. And we went out to over half the state to see what kind of facilities are out there, what does it really look like, and what are we really doing out here? What does the town want to see? 70% of the towns want sidewalks and bikeability. The other 30%, they don't want anything to deal with any of that.
Especially bus shelters.
Especially bus shelters. But it was important for us because it was a preliminary way to do that data collection that we needed to say, hey, where can we make new investments? What can we see? Fast forward now, we have said state-funded programs that we're adamantly working with the municipalities and with the COGs. Rick, I see you up there.
No, we're ready when you are. We're going to move on to the Q&A.
Right.
Before you do that, I just wanted to make
Q&A,
one last plug that what we're doing at the COG. Rick mentioned the look forward and look back. We are planning to apply for Safe Streets for All grant from the U.S. Department of Transportation. Yes. It's going to be a regional program, and we contacted all our municipalities to look at and ask them for their ideas for improving pedestrian safety, bicycle safety, and minor intersection improvements. So hopefully next time we come, we'll be wrapping up that study. So I guess with that, start Q&A.
Sure. So I don't know. There we go. We have two people down front with microphones. If anyone has a question for the panel, just raise your hand. Thank you. Just raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you. Right here.
Hi, Karen Reddington Hughes from Woodbury. I'm curious about how many of the 19 towns would fit the criteria of, quote, walkability to begin with, because that seems to be like the beginning of the equation. My other question also is, I know that many of the towns, especially if you are in a historic area, have sidewalks that are already there, but they would not meet the ADA, requirements. It's very difficult for those towns to get any types of grants to replace them. They seem to have an abundance of grants that will bring those sidewalks forward, and I like to say it's the sidewalk to nowhere then. But there's nothing to help them with digging up the sidewalks and replacing them so that they are ADA compliant.
Who wants to tackle that one?
That's a good one.
Why don't we start with walkability of the 19 communities in the COG? Rich, Mark, do you want to? Either one of you want to?
Yeah, I think. I think when we think of walkability, we think of a traditional urban center, somewhere like East Main Street here in Waterbury. But I don't think that is the only place that's worth walking. I think all 19 of our towns in this region and all 169 towns here in Connecticut have places that are worth walking to. And would be worth walking to and would be walked to more often if the infrastructure existed to make it comfortable to do so and to make it interesting to do so.
Well, I mean, that's a good point. We have lots of commercial areas developed in the 70s, 80s, didn't really put in sidewalks, lots of strip centers that people drive to, but not a lot of pedestrian amenities to get there.
I was just going to add specific to the question regarding Woodbury, because again, as the mayor indicated in his remarks, we're not just for the center city centric. We're trying to help all our communities, and the region is very diverse. We have very rural areas to very densely populated urban centers. In terms of Woodbury specifically, the Safe Streets for All project that we're looking at is going to target some improvements in all our communities. And what you alluded to, older sidewalks that may not be the proper width or might not have the proper grade or have started to deteriorate, we're hoping to rectify those. And also with Woodbury, we're starting a planning study on US Route 6, which is the main route through town, which really has a very strong pedestrian component to it. So we do try to look at all towns regardless of size. And in terms of which ones are currently walkable now, well, it depends. There is not one definition. One definition does not fit all communities. So what's walkable in Woodbury or Middlebury or Southbury may not be walkable in the city of Waterbury or Derby or Ansonia. So it is very context sensitive. Anybody else want to?
Just to add in, walkability can be defined as a case-by-case scenario, depending on what the town is. From what I've seen from a statewide perspective, we've seen walkability communities as in urban areas, but sometimes with a smaller town, it could be around their schools. Maybe it's a safe route to school from a neighborhood to a school system in a rural or a smaller town. Some towns have fairs, so what I've seen is they have a designated parking area and they'll create sidewalks to get from, I get it, it's a tourist, maybe they use it once or twice a year, but they can park in one area and then they can have sidewalks provided to the fairgrounds or churches, for example. I've seen that as well. So, you know, you may think walkability from an urban standpoint, sidewalks everywhere, but then that may not necessarily be the case. Depends if you're trying to get a group of people from one area to another. You might just develop that area.
So, Patrick, I don't want to put you on the spot on this, but to the question of there's no money, there are no resources to build sidewalks where they don't exist today. From the state's perspective, from the department's perspective, are there programs that will just pay for sidewalks alone without any other road improvements going on, say on a state facility, like a Route 1 or?
We have the Community Connectivity Grant Project program. It's designated for $600,000 or less, and that can be used as a perfect, you know, connecting communities as an opportunity. From state money, we look at environmental concerns or historic preservation of historic areas. Now, not knowing the detailed area, but there are ways that you can go in and improve those sidewalks. You have to pull a permit for that, and you know, we do a review board from our historic preservation. But I have seen areas in towns, such as Litchfield, for example, where we've given them money so they can do improvements on their sidewalks.
Doug?
Two quick thoughts. One, we're in historic Waterbury Theater, right? We're in the Palace Theater in Waterbury, and Frank Rice was a mayor. I think he's the last Republican mayor of New Haven. I think this is 1930s, 50s, I don't know. The gentleman built 200 miles of sidewalk in 6 years. Where there's a will, there's a way, and there needs to be political will to wrap all of the push in the mechanism to do it. So we still have about 200 miles that are unsidewalked in New Haven. We're not a complete grid, and so we have a lot of work still left to do. But it usually goes 20, 30, 40 years before the city adds a single foot of sidewalk. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Most of it is funding, a lot of it is maintenance, a lot of it is there's not been a lot of people asking for it. You know, even though the ADA, American Disabilities Act, is over 35 years old at this point, we still don't have equitable, accessible transportation networks. And the other funding aspect is how do you build it? You know, some cities, if you're going through a rapid development, you get a lot more touches at the opportunity to build infrastructure for pedestrians. So if you have a building that's going in, if you have a site plan review process or an automatic trigger for a site plan of greater than 20, greater than 40, greater than 60,000 square feet, you can automatically create some laws and standards to require sidewalks. But you gotta have teeth to those requirements or else people just apologize and never do it. 75-year-old sidewalks are a good problem to have. That means 75 years ago, somebody cared one time, because this infrastructure doesn't take a lot of upkeep. You gotta plow it 3 times a year, sweep it twice, and in 75 years, you might have to replace it.
Thanks, Doug. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Aaron?
Yes, I'm Patrick Stolman from the Children's Community School, and I have a question about I'm sorry, it's probably not for the panelists, but a number of our students and the parents take the Waterbury City school bus to the school, and currently there's no fare charged, and I'm told that that's going to end in December. I'm not certain if anybody on the stage can answer that question for me or point me in the right direction, but if that's going to be extended through the next semesters through the spring. Thank you.
I wish we could answer that question for you. We don't do school transportation. That's a whole other world. Mark, no. I would advise you to talk to the Board of Education, reach out to the Board of Ed. That's the best I can do.
You're referring to students who use the CT transit buses, not just regular school buses, correct?
Right now, all buses are free until December the 1st, and I'm hearing that will end at the moment, that all buses are free. So if students used to have a pass, they'll have to have a pass, I'm guessing, after December 1st.
But if they have a pass, they're still going to be allowed on.
I would imagine. That's what a pass, yeah.
Patrick, you don't know the answer to that question for CT Transit? Okay. All right. Do we have others? Yes, Karen.
Hi, my name is Lynn. This is directed more for Mr. Zapacca. We as a community have been working very diligently in creating complete streets and designing bump outs so pedestrians are safer, creating bike paths that take you right to the transit center. But we've had a lot of pushback from DOT because they don't want to see that bike path come right up to the train station because, oh my gosh, all those pedestrians coming off of the train are going to get run over by all those people on the bikes. Or the bump outs are going to create havoc for the state snowplows that have to go down the road. And so then we have to jump through a gazillion additional hoops. It's great to hear from you that there's a shift in the thought process, but that it's only on the planning side of DOT, and it doesn't seem to have filtered down to those engineers. How do we get through that barrier? Because it's really holding up a lot of work that we've done at the local level to really improve the area.
You know, I'm just curious on specifically who in the department, you know, at headquarters, you know, with planning and you know, our traffic engineers, and we have a project development unit that we work very closely with, and, you know, we're all on board for those complete streets, and from what it sounds like where a lot of pushback comes from is our district maintenance. When you pull through like encroachment permits and they want to do the design reviews, I know traditionally, and I don't know how long ago, they are accepting bump outs, but there's strict standards. They may say, no, this is not acceptable. However, they do have standards where it's, if it bumps out so many feet, you have to go back so many feet for a smoother transition to have those bump outs occur.
Well, Patrick, I'll bail you out a little bit on this one. We've had this experience. The COG gets involved in these sorts of design projects. One of our priorities are state roads that are main streets in our communities. We prioritize these. We go and meet with the Department of Transportation to talk about this. But oftentimes this is a maintenance issue. If you want bump outs on the state facility, usually the municipality has to agree to take up maintenance, snow plowing, and the rest of it. That's usually the way it works, and we've been successful in making that happen.
And I've had a number of these projects go through the similar, and they do allow a flared bump out. Yeah. So one that their plow can still go by at 40 miles an hour without damaging the plow. But if you have a business improvement district, you might be able to work with a non-governmental agency to take on that maintenance request. Because in my experience, it was only then the parking lane that the city had to maintain with regards to snow plowing. And so if a business improvement district's there, they can take care of it. They have boots on the ground. And that's one way to kind of, you know, not change the regulation, but work within the regulation.
And so what I've seen sometimes, you know, when you're working with, say, our district or department, just because we say no doesn't mean that's it. The turnaround question should be, all right, well, this is our goal. How can we get there? And I think sometimes, you know, dealing with engineering, it seems to be very black and white. However, you know, by just posing questions like, all right, well, if you won't accept this type of bump out, what will you accept? And then opening up that conversation, you know, can help you get in the right direction. And I do know, like in planning, we just don't do planning anymore. We're very, very much involved in our design and our construction. We work very closely with our district maintenance. So we're starting to have that conversation more and more because we know traditionally that was always a problem.
Thank you, Patrick. I don't know if there are any more questions. We're on a tight schedule right now. So if there's nothing else, I want to thank everyone. A round of applause for our panelists and moderator.